Hi, I'm Jacqueline.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
So it's really cold here today, and it's like almost so it's really cold
Well,
here
then.
today, and it's almost April, and I'm really just not. I'm not about that. Like it was snowing this morning, and I know
Hmm.
East Tennessee is notorious for a random snow in March. Like it seems like it happens like every year, but it's always so hard when you have the nice, pretty, like warm 60s, 70s, sunny days, and then it drops back down.
Hmm.
It's like I can handle it through the winter. We're fine, but then you get a little peak of that almost spring and then it goes back and then it's just really depressing.
Yeah, it was pretty cold today. I didn't leave my house because I was like, it's too cold out there. I'm not
Yeah.
doing that. And I had chili for dinner, which
Mm,
I had planned to make chili and didn't know it was going to be this cold. And then I was like,
yeah.
perfect timing. So,
That is a nice cold weather meal. I also think it's funny how like I unless it's like pouring down rain, I pretty much go on a walk with my daughter and my dogs every single day. And like through the winter, like it'll be like 30 degrees. And so we're all just bundled up and we go for our walk. And then, like I said, you have those nice pretty days and then it drops back down to like 45. And I'm like, oh my God, it's way too cold. I can't go for a walk today. And it's just like I'll walk all
yeah.
winter, no problem. But like once I get a glimpse of what's coming, then I can't go back. It's too tough, you know?
Yeah, it's a little too cold. I don't like the cold. I'm not
No.
dedicated enough to a walk to go in the cold. So,
I mean, I don't really want to, but my dogs need the exercise. And also sometimes we just got to get out of the house because sometimes just days on end indoors with a toddler working from home, you got to have a little change of scenery. So
yeah.
even though it's cold, sometimes we just gotta get out there and just get going. But at least it was sunny today. I mean, it was a pretty day. It was just
It looked
cold.
pretty, but it was,
Yeah.
yeah, just cold.
Yeah. Yeah, I really didn't it didn't have anything to go with. I just my brain kind of went blank as soon as we started recording, and that's what I went with. But it is a long episode today, so I know we do have one update before we get started that Courtney just informed me about. So, Courtney, would you like to inform everyone else as well?
Yeah, so you guys might have seen it. I've seen a little bit of like people posting it. But it was basically this guy, Timothy Beliefnik, I think is how you pronounce it, was just charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and home invasion and the death of Rebecca, his wife. She was found dead in her Illinois home. So I don't know if they were estranged since I think she maybe had a different home.
Hmm.
And you're probably like, why is this being shared a lot? No offense to Rebecca, but whatever. And it's because, oh, this article does say they have been separated for 2 years at this
Okay.
point. So why it's kind of making a lot of news is because in 2020 he was on a Family Feud episode with his parents and siblings, and the question was, "What's your biggest mistake you made at your wedding?" And he responded, "Honey, I love you, but said I do," as his biggest mistake.
Mm.
And
Which,
then now he's being
yikes.
charged, you know, which
Yeah.
his attorney is trying to be like, it's a game show, it's a silly, silly show, a silly question, a silly answer. Doesn't make him a murderer, but he was also just charged
Yeah. Like
for
I assume
murder.
there's, obviously other evidence to arrest him for that. But I feel like that also could kind of lead to some premeditation there that, obviously that again, I guess not because he didn't say he was going to kill her, but it's like, oh, okay. And also you said they were
Yeah,
separated for 2 years, which that would have been, a little over 2 years ago. So maybe that led to their separation because,
maybe because he was on, you know, they probably got separated like soon after. If it was a 2020
yeah,
episode, I don't know if maybe they recorded it in 2019 or anything
yeah,
like that, and then now it's 2023. So I don't really know
that's true. I guess there was a
timeline
little bit
that
of
way.
time there that could have,
Um,
yikes.
but yeah, I mean, maybe I don't. From what it sounds like in the article, it sounds like he did it, but I mean, maybe
Hmm.
he's just charged with it. Maybe, I mean, I'm assuming there's some evidence to charge him. But yeah, just kind of eerie. Like, I don't think his attorney is wrong in the comment that him answering this doesn't make him a murderer, but
Hmm.
it's pretty eerie. Like, if you look back in
Yeah.
hindsight,
Definitely
now
does
that he
not look
answered that
good.
way.
I mean, even like if you didn't do it, sir, like you kind of fucked up by saying that because now you're just putting yourself in a real unfortunate position because a
Yeah.
lot of people are going to see and know that going into your trial and everything. So But
Yeah,
yeah.
well, we're going to go ahead and get into this episode. We'll go ahead and give a trigger warning. This episode's a little bit gruesome. There is
Yeah.
also child death in it as well. But also there's just kind of some gruesome details. We tried not to get like too in depth on it, but we did have to touch on some of the things. So
Hmm.
just fair warning, if you're like, I really can't listen to this, we get it.
Yeah.
So our sources for this episode are The Vampire of Sacramento by Geneva Ortiz, The Sacramento Vampire by Jack Smith, and an allthat'sinteresting.com article. So in December 1977 and January 1978, a murderer would kill 6 people in Sacramento, with the crimes escalating drastically each time. He would be later known and remembered as the Vampire of Sacramento. So on December 29th, 1977, Ambrose and Carol Griffin had returned home to Robertson Avenue, which is a suburb in Sacramento's east side, from grocery shopping. So they're bringing their groceries inside, and once the wife went inside, she heard a loud noise. When she came back out, her husband, 51-year-old Ambrose, had been shot. So Carol called the police, but unfortunately, Ambrose was dead, like by the time they arrived. So Ambrose was an engineer with the Federal Bureau of Land Management. He was friendly and easygoing. He loved his wife and their 2 sons, Rick and Bob. His coworkers spoke highly of him, and investigators were really confused why someone just like kill him in a drive-by shooting. Like he's literally just bringing his groceries in, and someone just like drive. Like who would have done this?
Yeah, like
Basically,
I feel like normally drive-by shootings are intentional. Like I can't think of many cases where it's just like a random kind of thing. It's usually drug related or gang related or something where like that person is a specific hit and not just a random shooting. So yeah, I can see where that would be kind of confusing if they're like, there's no reason that we can come up with of why someone would do this to him.
yeah, because they tried to see if there was anything like seedy in his past or
Yeah.
dealings, and they couldn't find anything.
Yeah.
And honestly, like any lead they had just ended up going nowhere. It just seemed to be random. And so with that, it's hard to like gain any traction with the case until one day a 12-year-old boy came forward. He'd been riding his bike to a store a few blocks away, and a brown Pontiac Trans Am drove by. It was his favorite car. So he stopped to watch it drive by and noticed the driver took his hands away from the steering wheel, pulled out a gun, and like shot at him. Thankfully, the shot missed. And the boy hadn't really seen the driver, only he was like a brown haired male, likely in early 20s. So they tried to put the boy under hypnosis because this is the 70s. So they're like, maybe he could remember stuff. And he was actually able to end up recalling a few more details, including he said like the license plate number. But when they ran the license plate number and similar numbers, no match came up. So it wasn't like an accurate memory, basically,
Yeah.
which happens with hypnosis, which is why you can't use it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I'm like, yeah, I feel like that's pretty common with hypnosis of like you think you remembered something, but then it turns out to not be accurate, which is why can't really be used for like eyewitness, statements and stuff because like, oh yeah, I remember this person that looked like XYZ, and you don't have like a system like you do with a license plate to like verify whether or not that was accurate, and then you're just going off this completely false memory.
Yeah. There were also no registered Trans Am owners in Sacramento. So maybe they're like, maybe he just thought the car was wrong, like whatever. And unfortunately, the boy just like couldn't help anymore, couldn't remember anything else. Then on January 9th, 1978, another lead came forward. So a police report had been filed 2 days before Ambrose's murder, where Dorothy Plinsky, who lived a few blocks away from the Griffin house, reported a shot had been fired into her home. So it happened around 6:30 p.m. The shot broke the kitchen window, and she said something hot went above her head and even like pierced her bun on top of her head. So she like touched her
Wow.
hair, like couldn't find anything. She's like, what was that?
Oh, wow,
Like,
that is terrifying.
yeah, just imagining it going just like so close to the top of your head.
And imagine like, oh, if I was like a couple of inches taller, like, or I was standing
Right.
on my tiptoes for some reason, or
Hmm.
wow.
So there were no injuries. So the police report was pretty brief, but investigators decided to follow up because they're like, this could be connected, another just like random drive-by shooting. So they interviewed her again, and she told them everything she could remember, and they wanted to look at her kitchen again. So they finally were able to find the bullet in a cupboard behind cups and dishes that somehow had not been broken. So it just went like
Wow.
perfectly into the back of this cupboard and was there, basically.
That is insane. Like if you believe in any kind of higher power, I feel like this is an instance where you're like, someone directed this bullet. Like,
A lot of this case, too, and the books talked about it with the investigators being like, are we being punked? Because it's like so many
wow.
things just kind of fell into their lap. Like
Yeah.
once they started getting leads that were like credible and they could follow, it was like everything was just there. They were like,
Wow. Yeah.
they're like, what do you mean it's this easy? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this can't be it. Like,
Yeah.
so they took it for lab testing, and the bullet did match the gun that was used to kill Ambrose. So they were bullets from the same gun. And they now believe they were dealing with a murderer who was just like impulsive and random. Like he's just shooting at boys on the street, at people bringing in their groceries, houses, just everywhere. So 2 weeks later, on January 23rd at around 10 a.m., Janine Layton was home watching television when she heard a noise in her yard. So she went to investigate and spotted a man coming toward the house. He seemed like he had like a lack of hygiene. His appearance was concerning. He just kind of looked disheveled, like really like this man has not showered in a long time. He's not taking care of himself. So she did freeze with fear because he was reaching the patio and he tried to open the door, but it was locked. The man then went to the windows to see if they were open as well, but thankfully they were all still locked. So he's trying any entrance. Everything is still locked, thankfully. So Janine thought he'd left. So she went to the kitchen to try and just like busy herself because she's kind of like shaken up. So she was like, let me just do something to take my mind off of it. When she looked up and saw him standing in front of the window with wide animal like eyes, he said nothing and was just watching her. He eventually mumbled something like, excuse me, lit a cigarette, and just left. So Janine's obviously very shaken. And she thought
Mm-hmm.
about calling the police, but she was like, I don't want to be unreasonable. Like, he was creepy, but it's not like illegal to walk up to my house through the yard. Like, maybe he was lost. Maybe he's at the wrong house. Like, she kind of talked herself out of it because she was like, I don't want to take away from like real crimes. Like, you know.
Yeah. And I feel like we see this a lot too with people who like are arrested after incidents like this where they truly weren't doing anything wrong and you're like
Mm-hmm.
and you get frustrated because you're like, oh, this person was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or like it's someone that's homeless and they accidentally wandered through and now they're like in jail for that or whatever. So you're like, oh, I don't want to be that person that like wrongfully gets someone put, in jail or whatever. But then also there are times that you're like, sometimes your gut feeling is right. Like,
Mm-hmm. That's the thing too. And I think as a woman and as women, we do this too, because it's like,
yeah.
the police show up and they're going to be like, oh, so you're calling because someone was in your yard? Like, what?
Can
Like,
we talk about how someone literally was like trying to get in Courtney's door and Courtney posted about it on her Ring doorbell app and people were like, oh, so someone just walked on your front porch and you think you need to post about it? It's literally the
yeah,
exact same situation. I mean, obviously,
literally exact
I
same.
assume that person is not who this person ends up being, but it's a very like the same
It's
type
very
thing.
similar. Yeah. It
Yeah.
was 2 a.m. We have a glass, our front door's glass. They're looking in, they're touching it, they're touching stuff on my porch.
Hmm.
I post it just to be like, hey guys, lock your doors. Because some people
Yeah.
still don't. And if my door was unlocked, he might have come into the house. And
Hmm.
yeah, someone's just like, crime of the century over here. If you don't have a no trespassing sign, it's not illegal. And I'm like, well, that is not true. Like, this is my front porch. Like, that
Yeah.
is my property.
Yeah,
Like,
you're like it's
but
still trespassing, but also you didn't call the police, which you could have reasonably done so to be like, hey, I just want to, you
mhm.
know, I would like someone to come out and make sure everything looks okay or whatever it may be. But it's like you didn't do that. You were just telling your neighbors, hey, maybe watch out for this person who I'm not sure. And I think I can't remember how you phrased it, but it was like super like polite and like respectful
Yeah.
towards this person where you're like, I don't know who he is or if he belongs here or whatever, but I just want to like share because it's
Yeah.
kind of weird that someone would be like looking in your door. And a
Yeah, and
response like that, it's like that's why people are afraid to contact someone when stuff like this happens.
I didn't want the police involved at all. I
Yeah.
only like the ring neighborhood thing is just so you can be like, hey, somebody was up here. I'm just being like, we don't see a lot of posts in my area.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to be like, hey, like if you're near me, like just be careful. Like
Yeah.
I'm like, maybe he was just lost, maybe he needed help. I don't know. But just watch out because you don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure it was even worse back in the 70s. So,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
so half an hour later, Robert Edwards and his wife Barbara returned from a shopping trip to their home on 2929 Bernice Street. So, right as they were about to unlock their door, they heard the sound of someone walking inside. And they're like, this is kind of concerning because there should be no one inside. Like the house was empty when we left it. A few minutes later, Robert spotted the intruder, and he was like a filthy, disheveled young man. He'd come out from behind a corner of the house. He tried to get him to stop, but the intruder ran. So Robert actually chased him, but he was able to kind of like just be a step ahead the whole time. It just kind of slipped through his fingertips. He yelled, "Stop!" again, and the man like was climbing up this like fence and was like, "I'm just taking a shortcut," which was kind of odd. He was like,
Like
"What?
through my house?
A shortcut where? I'm chasing you because you're in my house. What do you mean shortcut?"
Like what?
So Robert just gave up at this point. And when he returned home, law enforcement had arrived. And the police concluded that the intruder had come in and out through the same like back room window because there were footprints in the soil. And this intruder had left the place a mess. Closets and drawers were wide open. Piles of clothing were like thrown across the floor. He'd gone through like every inch of this house looking for anything to steal, to sell. He'd been unsuccessful in taking their cash and valuables. So, like all of their rings, a set of binoculars, a stethoscope, a cassette player, and like a decorative dagger had been in a cloth bag that he'd left behind when he heard the couple coming home. So they got lucky. Like they once they heard him, he just dropped the bag and ran. It seemed like it wasn't all about like money either. It just seemed like the thrill of just invading someone's private space. And Robert and Barbara went in the back of the house and were extremely upset when they saw the intruder had been in their child's bedroom and he'd urinated inside the drawer, like over the child's clothing and pooped on the bed.
Like I just what a complete, like you said, just invasion of privacy, invasion of like your home and your things and your child's things. And how do you ever walk in that room again and not think about that? Just like completely ruining like the sanctity of your
Mm-hmm.
own home, you know?
Yeah. And like clearly just to like make a mess. So it was just like weird. So later this day, 22-year-old Teresa Wallen had returned home from running errands. She was home at her house at 2360 Tioga Way. Teresa was described as well liked. She was a pretty, sweet woman with bright blue eyes and a warm smile. She was a cheerful person who seemed to just like radiate happiness. She'd recently gotten married to her husband, David, and they hadn't been married long, but they did have a happy and stable relationship. And she'd recently gotten a job working for the state. And her and David did dream of having children, like they wanted to have a family, all of that. But on this day, she was in the middle of taking her kitchen's garbage out when the front door suddenly swung open, and there was a man who was armed with a gun. So Teresa dropped the trash bags and put her arms up in shock. So the man fired twice, and the first bullet shot through the palm of her hand, tore through her forearm, exploded out her elbow, and hit her in the head, which is like a lot happening on that first shot.
Jesus.
And the other tore through her cheek and broke her jaw. So Teresa fell to the floor, and the man fired a third shot at close range into her head. So David was at work and did not return home until later that evening. Like they kind of described it in the book that like they were working and it had been a long day, and he had like had a few drinks with his friends after work. So it was like quite a bit later that he's coming home. So he thought something was kind of wrong when he pulled up to the house because like all of the lights were off, but the stereo was on. And he was like, normally Teresa like to have like lights on in the house, like make it look kind of busy. So why are all the lights off and the stereo is on? Their pet German Shepherd Brutus was also sitting and waiting, and he kind of seemed like restless and nervous. So David called out for Teresa, but got no response. So he opened the door to the main bedroom and found Teresa. She was almost completely naked with her legs splayed apart. Her abdomen had been cut open, and some of her internal organs were on her abdomen. He could see her face that looked like it was just like frozen in fear. He was like, I could just see like when she had died, she was in such like panic and shock and fear.
Which to imagine like coming home to your significant other murdered in general is horrifying.
Mhm.
But to come home and see them like in this state, like you will literally never get over this kind of trauma, you know?
No. So David actually called his parents, who would also come to the house. So he hadn't necessarily called 911 immediately, like he'd also called some people. So police and media eventually did come to the scene, and police tried to take a note of everyone who'd entered and left the house since his parents had gone in, like quite a few people had gone into this house. And police found that the killer had shot a single shot into the mailbox, which was kind of odd. But they discovered that this 22 caliber bullet was also the same one that had been used to kill Ambrose Griffin. So police also discovered that nothing was missing from the house that they could tell. Teresa still wore all her jewelry and valuables were still in the house. Money in Teresa's purse was still there. So like clearly this wasn't like a robbery gone wrong. Like they left everything. Her abdominal cavity was nearly empty because most of her organs had been pulled out. And a closer look also revealed that one of her nipples had been sliced off. So Teresa's autopsy also revealed even more disturbing details than even that, basically. It did not appear that Teresa had been raped, but it did appear that her killer had like explored her insides, like touched all of her organs and messed around. The knife had also been thrust so deeply into her abdomen that it hit the base of her spinal column. So again, this is also like just brutal. So the killer had like thoroughly dug and cut into her internal organs. More details are out there, but it's quite gruesome. So I think if you want that information, both books I read are on Kindle Unlimited, so you can get it there. But I think for us, that's enough detail for now.
And those are some pretty graphic details. So for like your statement at the end to be like, and more is out there if you want to know. And it's like you can only imagine what's out there that we did not share.
It's basically like very detailed into how
Yeah.
every organ was damaged and what happened to it. And I just
You
couldn't.
don't need that. Yeah. Courtney did the research for this episode and I started reading through the notes and like I literally sent her a screenshot and circled some phrases and I was like, but you didn't leave, but you left out some of the gruesome details because Courtney's like, yeah, so you can only imagine what I read that did not make it in this episode. And I'm like, well, thank you for sparing me that at least.
Yeah. And like, I normally don't get too squeamish, but I got kind of squeamish.
Yeah, this is a bit much. Yeah.
Like reading some of it, I was like, I can't read that on the podcast. I can't do it.
No.
And I just don't think it's necessary. I mean, she was brutally murdered, and that's just kind of what you need to know.
Yeah.
It was also revealed that Teresa was 3 months pregnant as well. So she was about to have her first kid. And, you know, her and David had dreamed of a family. So just a more heartbreak on top of that.
Yeah.
So police found no fingerprints. So they believe the killer had worn gloves and cleaned up after himself. The killer's escape route was found in the yard because part of the yard was underwater and a wooden board to the ones inside the house. So the killer could have easily like slipped away unseen by neighbors. However, a few people did say they saw a suspicious man the day of the murder. Each gave a similar description. He was dirty, skinny, weird white man in a bright orange parka, which like bright orange parka, like you're just trying to make yourself know.
Right? Like that's not a usual choice of clothing for someone who's trying to hide from people or be discreet.
So police tried to follow any leads they could. They investigated a former partner of David's who was described as like obsessed with him, but she had a strong alibi. So it's kind of like Ambrose, where it's like she doesn't really have any enemies. Who would want to do this? And in especially Teresa's case, so brutally. So just not a lot of leads on this one. So on January 27th, Neon Grangard had the day off and wanted to take a trip to the mountains with her children to see some snow. So she asked her best friend, Evelyn Meredith, who lived across the street, if she wanted to come, but Evelyn was unable to. So 36-year-old Evelyn was a popular woman. She had many friends and relatives in the neighborhood, and she often babysat for them. She was a divorced single mother to two boys, 13-year-old Vernon and 6-year-old Jason, but she still managed to lead like an active social life and even had a steady new boyfriend. So she lived across the street from Neon, and since Evelyn couldn't go due to babysitting her nephew, she agreed like Jason could come. She was like, I'll take Jason over. He can go with you, see some snow, have a good day. So Neon waited for Evelyn to bring Jason over, but she hadn't yet. And she said this was just kind of odd. She was like, she's normally so punctual, or she'd let me know. She did see that Danny Meredith's car was in the driveway, which was common. So in some sources, Danny Meredith was just described as a friend, but in others, it was said that this was Evelyn's boyfriend, the steady boyfriend she had. So I believe it probably was, but sources vary.
Yeah.
So since Evelyn wasn't normally late, Neon decided to have her 6-year-old daughter, Tracy, go see what was taking so long. So Tracy knocked, but there was no answer. It almost appeared like no one was home. And by now, Danny's car was gone. So she's like, well, that's weird. Like he was here and he left. But why has Evelyn still not come over or at least told me Jason can't come? Like, what is happening?
Yeah.
And at this point, Neon's just like annoyed. She's like, how can she be so inconsiderate? Like, I'm going to miss my opportunity. And like, I'm about to just leave. Like, she's just annoyed. So she's like, I'm just going to leave without Jason. Like, clearly something happened. Like, I'm just going to go on about my day. However, she ran into a fellow neighbor, Nancy Turner, who was also worried. Like, once Neon told her everything, Nancy's like, that's kind of weird. Yeah. So she decided to go check and went to the back of the house, and the door was unlocked. She went inside and looked around, and Nancy soon came across 50-year-old Danny Meredith's body face down on the floor. And so she ran back out to Neon and told her to call for help.
So police arrived just after noon, and the officer went into the house. And at first he assumed that Danny was just like passed out drunk, but then when he saw him, he realized that he'd actually lost so much blood that the stains around him were just like almost black, like just that level of volume that had come out of him. And he looked closer, and there were 2 bullet wounds to Danny's head, and he did find a trail of blood that led to the bathroom. There he saw the tub was also full of bloody water, and he went back out and looked in the main bedroom, and this is where he found Evelyn. So she was undressed, and her legs were spread open, and she had just been like eviscerated from her sternum down to the hip. Her organs had been pulled out, very similar to the Teresa Wallen scene. So the officers sealed off the area and waited for the others to arrive. So in the living room, they found 22 caliber bullets on the floor. The autopsy would reveal that Evelyn had been raped, and the killer's semen was found like inside her rectum. She had also been raped with a butcher knife and just had horrible injuries to her rectal wall and her uterus. Her eye had been cut out and removed. And officers also found it odd that like Evelyn received such brutal injuries, but Danny had not. Like Danny had just been shot to death. And officers were also so overwhelmed at the sight of Evelyn's body that they nearly overlooked little Jason on the bed. So he had been dressed and ready for the trip to the mountains, and he had also been shot with a 22 caliber bullet. So they did find a footprint in the soil outside that matched the one found at the Wallen house, and officers asked neighbors if they had seen anything. And so an 11-year-old girl did describe seeing a skinny, brown-haired white man in his early 20s wearing a brightly colored jacket. And they also noted that Danny's car was missing and wondered if like the killer had taken it. So eventually a woman named Karen Ferreria showed up to the house, and she was looking for her 22-month-old son, David. She was worried because like she heard what was going on, so she needed to come check on him. And so police searched the house again and found a 22 caliber bullet hole in a bloody pillow within the crib in one of the bedrooms. And some of the blood in the tub did end up being linked to David, but his body was not there. So like, where was this baby now? So with David being gone and the possibility of like him still being alive, the police did feel a new level of urgency to find this killer and hopefully find David. So Lieutenant Ray Biondi had received special psychological training by the FBI, so he started to like make a psychological profile of this killer. So at this point, they knew that he was a young white man who like neglected hygiene and grooming, likely suffered from a severe mental illness due to the severity of these crimes. Also, the fact that they had been carried out like during the day. Like you said, he's also wearing like this bright colored coat, like odd behavior from someone who would be like trying to hide from police. He also left behind footprints and cigarette butts, so was not trying to cover his tracks at all. They believed he was likely sexually frustrated and incompetent, and they doubted he had a stable job or stable friendships and relationships, and police just urged the public for any new leads they could find. So on January 28th, a 71-year-old woman reported an incident where she nearly collided with an erratic, long-haired man driving a red station wagon. So this was near Evelyn's neighborhood and did match the description of Danny's car. And Danny's car was eventually found abandoned quite a distance away from Teresa and Evelyn's neighborhood. However, detectives got another lead when a retired county marshal contacted them. So there had been a run-in with this like creepy man with his daughter-in-law, Nancy Holden. So she noticed that the police sketch closely resembled this man that she had the scary interaction with. So on the day of Teresa Wallen's murder, Nancy Holden was in the Pantry Market, which is a grocery store, and was like unaware of this person following her. But the man eventually started walking toward her and asked her, "Were you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" So Nancy was like really confused because like how did this man know about a man that she had dated 10 years ago? And Nancy and Kurt were not in a relationship anymore when he was in the motorcycle accident that ended his life. So she's just like, who is this person who's randomly coming up asking me about my ex-boyfriend that died like a decade ago, you know?
Yeah, very creepy for someone to say to you, just being
Yeah.
it's like, wait
Someone
a
that you have
minute.
no idea who they are.
Yeah.
So the man came closer and repeated the question, and she eventually recognized him as Richard Chase. So she really only knew this person because her older sister had dated him for a short period. So she talked for a bit and like tried to like leave, you know how you do, where you're just like, okay, well, I'm gonna get going now. But he just kept following her. And he asked her for a ride, but she was like, no, and quickly tried to get out of the store and leave. So she did hurry into the car and lock all of the doors, but Richard like caught up to her and was trying to open her doors, like clearly not letting her just walk away. And he actually held onto the handle until Nancy like was able to back up in her car and drive away. So the police didn't really think much of this tip, but when they ran his information through the DMV's computer, they did find that Richard Trenton Chase did match the physical description given of the killer. So officers followed up, and Nancy reported that the day at the grocery store, Richard was wearing blue jeans, black tennis shoes, and a bright orange parka. Coming up again. So who is this mystery man, Richard Chase? Well, Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23rd, 1950 in Santa Clara County, California. His parents were Richard Chase Sr., a computer specialist, and Beatrice, a teacher. And when he was 3, his family moved into a house in Sacramento. In 1953, his sister Pamela was born. Richard was a Cub Scout, and he played 4 years of Little League Baseball. He just seemed like a pretty normal, average child. He was well liked by his teachers. He was seen as a very sweet kid. He was very popular among his classmates. And as many families in the 1950s, Richard's parents were strict disciplinarians who punished pretty frequently. At the age of 2, he was actually force-fed by his father until he vomited. And Pamela would recall confrontations between Richard Sr. and Richard Jr. would end in Richard Sr. shaking him or throwing him against the wall. So Richard Sr. was allegedly emotionally abusive as well and just like yelled at Richard anytime he messed something up. It did appear that Richard Sr. also struggled with alcohol addiction and managing his money, and this would result in him and Beatrice fighting often and loudly in front of their young children. Beatrice would frequently accuse Richard Sr. of using dope and trying to poison her, and as the year went on, she would also accuse him of cheating on her with the neighbors. She even accused him of cheating while the family was on a camping trip in Oregon, so clearly just like not a safe household to be growing up in.
Just constant turmoil,
Yeah.
And I don't know if there was any validity to her cheating accusations, but I know like a lot of sources were like, the family did not know anyone in Oregon and they're on a family trip and she's just like, oh, I know you're cheating with me with all these people. And so it was like maybe there was some validity to some of them, but it was mostly just like constantly, I guess, anytime he looked at another woman, like accusations being thrown.
Yeah. And so obviously with all of these marital issues, they did not pay too much attention to their children. And Richard Sr. and Beatrice were also not seeing like the strange behaviors that Richard is starting to exhibit at this point. Because when he was 10, he developed a really grim interest with dead animals. He did like to kill and torture cats that he found around the neighborhood. He was very interested like in their blood and their like insides in a way that almost seemed clinical. And Richard later moved on to killing and torturing birds, rabbits, and dogs. And at one point he had killed so many neighborhood cats that neighbors like had started to notice how they were all suddenly going missing. And when he was 12, his mother started seeing two different psychiatrists for emotional issues. And at 13, his parents ended up losing their house. So, also around this time, Richard became convinced that he was a member of the James Younger Gang, which was a group of outlaws from the 19th century that included Jesse James. He had a poster made of the gang that had his picture on it, and just kept asking his mom to buy him a cowboy hat. And he also started doing other weird things, like he would burn pans while trying to cook for himself in the middle of the night. He would leave puddles on the kitchen floor and just other messes that he just would not clean up. He would randomly turn the heat on in the house to over 90 degrees. And whenever he was alone, he would just strip off his clothes and just spend the night lying on the couch in the living room in this 90-degree house. He liked to play with matches and would often set small fires. He also still wet the bed. So obviously very early in life, we are just hitting all of the McDonald triad here. So once Richard hit high school at Mira Loma High School, his parents separated. And Richard and Pamela went to live with Beatrice in Los Angeles with some relatives. So they did move right in the middle of his 9th grade year, which is tough because that's a big time for getting to know people and kind of settling in. And halfway through, they're moving to a new place. And only 8 days later, Richard Sr. followed them and brought Richard back to Sacramento. And then 4 months later, Beatrice and Pamela came back home. So just a lot of chaos and just not a consistent, stable environment for children. But Richard was still fitting in at school, and he was decently popular. He even went on a few dates with some girls. He did have 2 serious girlfriends, but both relationships ended because he had trouble, getting it up and keeping it up. And this was just humiliating for Richard. He felt his penis was broken. And for some reason, he jumped to the conclusion that his erectile dysfunction was because of a lack of blood. So to fix this, clearly, he thought he needed to consume the blood of animals, because that's a logical conclusion.
There is no other explanation.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. It
couldn't be anything else. So Richard was also experimenting with alcohol and drugs. He tried marijuana, would take large amounts of LSD and amphetamine. He also started stealing from neighbors and was still harming animals. So Richard Sr. was disappointed in him and felt like he had no direction, discipline, or values. And it did get worse when at 15 years old, he had his first run-in with the law for possession of marijuana. This was 1965, so it's kind of a big deal then. And even though Richard denied taking drugs, the juvenile court did order him to do community cleanup work on the weekends. And Richard Sr. did not try to get him a lawyer or protest the punishment. And this just made Richard resentful. His grades began to slip, and he just no longer cared about school. He had no ambition. He did still somehow manage to graduate from Mira Loma High School in June of 1968, and his parents bought him a Volkswagen as a present. And in late 1968, Richard got a job as a typist that he did hold for some time with the Retailer Credit Association.
So in 1969, Richard sought help from a psychiatrist about his erectile dysfunction and his emotional instability. Obviously, a rough childhood and his parents constantly fighting, financial troubles also added to his stress. So the psychiatrist said his erectile dysfunction was probably caused by an emotional issue, likely anxiety or maybe a repressed rage toward women. And he believed Richard was mentally ill, but not so much that he needed intervention. This did not help much because Richard still just continued to believe his body was just low on blood. He's I don't have an emotional issue. I'm just low on blood, as you do. So Richard was starting to spiral around this time. He grew his hair long. He neglected his hygiene. He withdrew from his friends. Richard Sr. was worried, but Beatrice just assumed he was going for the hippie look of the 60s. Richard eventually thought about going to college and enrolled in American River College. His parents were really excited. They're finally hopeful he's getting his life together. However, Richard was soon expelled for failing grades and not attending classes. He was basically taking a break, but didn't tell the school he was taking a break. She can't really do. So Richard had been kicked out of where he was living, but ran into 2 girls from high school who offered to let him live in the house they were renting. So they had a space for a 3rd roommate, and he accepted. However, the girls soon regretted this because his drug habit had not gotten any better. So he was still smoking marijuana, using LSD. He was constantly high, which made it impossible for the roommates to reason with him when he started acting weird. And he became increasingly paranoid. He really thought someone was out to get him. He boarded his bedroom door closed, knocked a hole in his closet closet wall and nailed the closet door shut from the inside. So, pretty paranoid. And he was unable to maintain a steady job, and he would make noise at all hours. And he was filthy. He rarely bathed. He didn't really do his laundry, just kind of gross. So his roommates were getting sick of him quickly, especially with the noise, the foul odor, and he'd even sometimes like come out of his room naked, smelling horrible, and just sit next to them on the couch. And when he tried to talk, his words were basically gibberish. So just nonsensical.
Quite an interesting roommate situation. I mean,
Yeah. So Richard's paranoia continued to increase as well. And once at a party at the house, he spent the night leaning out the window, waving a gun at strangers. So the roommates are like, yeah, this man has got to go.
I was like, I hope that was the final straw there because
that was.
Yikes.
But Richard refused to leave. And the women were kind of scared because, like, they know now he has a gun and he's clearly unstable. So they just ended up packing their bags and moving out instead. They were like, you have it. Have the house.
Yeah. Don't blame them there. Be like, I'm going to go. I'm the problem. It's me. It's fine. I'll just.
Yeah.
Nope.
Have
It's all
fun.
you.
Goodbye.
You're good.
So eventually, a brother of one of the former roommates moved in since Richard could not cover the rent by himself. And the roommate was in a band. This part's a little funny. The roommate was in a band, and Richard decided he wanted to join. So when the band would come over to practice, Richard would like show up with bongo drums, and he would just bang on them like without rhythm, sing loudly off key. Like anytime the band was there, he's just in here with his bongo drums, like singing at the top of his lungs off key.
They're like, great. This is great.
And the new roommate was over it and was able to kick him out. He was like, yeah, you're gone. Goodbye.
Like, you can't ruin my band, sir.
So Richard returned to living with Beatrice since his father had moved out after the separation. He grew more resentful each day and believed Beatrice was trying to poison him and control his mind. He continued to not have a stable job and just rely on his parents to pay for everything. They also paid his rent at the old house. So yeah, he's just relying on his parents, wants them to handle everything, including paying $500 worth of parking tickets he'd gotten. And like $500 in the 1970s is a lot of money. So in 1972, Richard left on a 2-week trip to Utah. He ended up getting arrested for traffic violations, and Beatrice bailed him out. Beatrice noticed something was not right with Richard. He was increasingly paranoid and very antsy, and he was saying the police poisoned him and made him sick. So Richard's continuing to believe he doesn't have enough blood, and now he also believes his body is like rapidly deteriorating. He thought his stomach was on backwards and his heart would stop beating occasionally. Like he'd be like, my heart's not beating. Just a lot of medical anxiety.
I mean, you could just like have normal medical anxiety like the rest of us where you're like, oh, like I have a tumor versus a pimple. But no, you're going to think that your stomach's backwards and your heart just doesn't beat all the time. Okay. Yeah.
Richard also started having fits where he would hit the walls and lose the ability to like speak and write. Like he would just become so belligerent he like couldn't do anything. And when he could talk, he would just argue with his mothers, and like the fight would turn physical. Like he would physically abuse her. So eventually Beatrice is like, nope, please leave. You're going to live with your father. And Richard Sr. really didn't want to give up on him. He just thought Richard was like misguided. Like he just needs to like push him to like work and better himself. Like that's just what he needs a push. But it unfortunately went nowhere. And eventually Richard moves back with Beatrice. So Richard became too much for Beatrice again as he was being physically violent again. And so he went to live with his grandmother in Los Angeles and got a job as a school bus driver for developmentally disabled children under his uncle. Richard, of course, performed poorly. As we see, he does not give any effort towards any job. He never cleaned the bus or did any of the maintenance, and he was fired after a year, but that was his longest job at this point. So once without a job, he resumed sleeping during the day, making noise at night. His grandmother was over it and sent him back to Sacramento around Christmas time. So at this point, and it continues, Richard is just being tossed around and he's making no effort to be independent. He's just being tossed from his mom to his father to his grandmother, and it continues. So he had a few more jobs, but nothing lasted long. And on April 22nd, 1973, he went to a small party at a friend's apartment and he watched one of the women there who was a girlfriend of like one of the party goers. And when the other men went to go purchase more alcohol, he was alone with her and tried to make a move. So he like grabbed her, he started like grope her and grope her breasts. The woman stepped back and like told him to stop, but he ignored her pleas. So she tried to run, but he chased her. And eventually the other men returned and like she told them what happened. So they forced Richard to leave. It was, kind of a big fight. He went into a rage and they all argued for about an hour before Richard finally left. So the party resumes. And then suddenly Richard just returns to this party where he just got into a fight with all these men and is starting to be hostile again. Like, what you doing?
Like, you got out of there. Why don't you just keep going? Like, why do you need to, like, these men want to kick your ass and you're gone now. Why don't you just leave?
Yeah. So a fist fight broke out at this point, and while the men attempted to subdue Richard, a small handgun fell out of his pocket. So one of the men threw it into a bedroom, and the police arrived, and he spent the night in jail and was charged with a misdemeanor. Again, just unsure how to handle Richard. His parents sent him back to LA with his grandmother. Her name was Holly Neese. And she's just shocked at how much worse Richard's gotten, even from the last time she saw him. He repeatedly told her he was sick, but he would never say with what. And then one night, Holly heard Richard having a conversation with someone, but like no one was there. Like he just kept saying, Richard, you're a good boy, aren't you? Yes, you're a good boy. So he's just like talking to himself like that.
Yeah, you usually start to get concerned when
Mhm.
something like that happens.
Yeah. And so Holly reached her limit and was like, so Holly reached her limit when she found out that he'd purchased a handgun. So she was like, you're acting like weird and now you're in my house with a gun.
Yeah.
No,
Now you own a
we're
gun.
done.
I don't think we need to continue this.
She was probably like, I'm too old for this shit.
Yeah.
Like, you're a grown man. Get out of my house.
Seriously. Yeah.
So only 2 months after arriving, she sent him back to Sacramento. He tried to live with his father, but they constantly bickered and fought. So no surprise, Richard moved back with Beatrice. And Beatrice and Pamela were both scared of him and his outburst because they're still happening. But Beatrice was just committed to helping him. Basically, she just didn't want to give up on her son, just kept.
Yeah, I'm like, that's your kid. It's hard to reach the point where you just say, like, no, we're not going to help you anymore. Especially at this point where, like, it's not like you're aware of him hurting anyone. You're just, you can't hold down a job and you just have this weird erratic behavior, clearly some kind of mental illness going on. Like, it's hard to give up on your kid when that's happening, you know?
Yeah. On December 1st, 1973, Richard was admitted to the American River Hospital. Richard had said his heart wasn't beating and some of the other ailments that he like made himself believe. So tests revealed there was nothing physically wrong with him, but the doctor believed Richard was dealing with a mental health issue since he is like saying his heart's not beating and all these other things. And he thought he was likely suffering from chronic acute paranoid schizophrenia. The doctor also believed it could be toxic psychosis from all the drug use, like from all the LSD, from all the weed. He just has no basis of reality anymore from such excessive drug use. But Richard did end up leaving the hospital and didn't come back. So Richard started at this time abusing animals again. He tortured the family dog, even so much as like breaking the dog's skull. And like the dog struggled to like eat normally after this.
That's so sad.
Eventually, his parents set him up with an apartment so he could live alone since the back and forth's not working. They're like, we're just going to pay for this apartment and let you be alone because you're abusing all of us and we're done.
Yeah, that sounds a lot easier.
Yeah. So he started hunting rabbits and would keep them in his apartment, and he would drink their blood and blend their organs into a smoothie. And at one point, he got very ill.
I think I know why that might be, actually.
Oh, it gets worse.
It might have something to do with what you're
Yeah.
consuming.
It gets worse because the doctor believed he likely had blood poisoning and was going into septic shock, but the doctor thought it was weird that it would be like this severe from like eating the rabbit. But he soon discovered that Richard had not just been drinking rabbit blood, but injecting himself with it. So,
I feel like that might contribute to your illness here, Richard.
yeah. And at the hospital, he started saying again how his blood was low. He said his blood pressure was 0. Just, his normal little tangent he's going on. And the doctor soon realized there's like something more. And he also thought Richard had paranoid schizophrenia. And I think they said too, like around this age is when it starts showing in men as well. So it's like could make sense that maybe as a kid they didn't really show it, but now as he's getting older. And after he recovered from this blood poisoning, they sent him to the psychiatric ward of the American River Hospital, and he was held for 14 days. Richard was very unhappy with this. He protested. Again, he doesn't think he has a mental health issue. He thinks his blood is low. So he was admitted on April 28th, 1976. And 2 days later, he tried to run out the back door. So he was able to escape, but his father brought him back the next day. The staff believed he needed more intensive care, so they transferred him to Beverly Manor, which is a facility that like specialized in mental health. And they did this on May 1st. A doctor there diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, and Richard was not happy there. He insisted, I don't need mental health assistance. I need more blood. My blood's low. And while at this facility, he continued to kill animals and was frequently caught with like dead birds in his room. And the staff actually gave him the nickname Dracula because of how often they'd see him drinking bird's blood just in the hospital.
I just keep opening my mouth to talk, but like I don't even know. No, there's really not.
So a lot of the medication didn't help Richard as much as they hoped. So they decided that Richard Sr. and Beatrice should be his conservators. So like a conservatorship is like a type of legal guardianship where Richard Sr. and Beatrice would make all his living decisions as well as manage like his relationships and finances. Richard was okay with this. And his condition improved, but by September, they felt that he'd become like well enough to be discharged. And the hospital staff kind of disapproved with him being released. And many claimed like the real reason was overcrowding, like not that he was better, it was just they had no more room. Richard did seem to adjust well back into like his apartment. And in 1977, when it came time to renew their conservatorship, they didn't believe it was necessary anymore. So Richard, with his new independence, decided to move out of his apartment and travel across the country because, it's normal. He went to a few places, but eventually came back to Sacramento. Richard was doing well for a while, but slowly as summer approached, he started to become more and more like deranged is kind of how they described it, more just losing touch again, paranoid. He started to torture the family dogs again and killed both family dogs as well as the family cat.
Okay, so it just keeps getting better.
And then police found out it wasn't him, and our new suspect is John Smith. No, I'm just kidding.
You're like, okay, so who?
Okay, we just talked all this time, and it's not even the real person. I'm going to do that to you guys one time, I swear.
One time, we're going to do it. In August of 1977, he was found in the Lake Tahoe area of Nevada late one night, covered in blood, with a liver in a bucket in the back of his pickup truck. They did eventually determine that the blood and liver was from a cow and not human, so they did let him go. But also, why do you have a liver in a bucket? No matter whose liver it is. But anyway.
Yeah.
So Richard bought a gun, and on December 26th, he purchased an extra box of ammunition. 3 days later, he drove around until he reached Robertson Avenue, which is a suburb in Sacramento's east side, and Richard wanted to see what it felt like to escalate from killing animals to killing humans. And as he was driving, he spotted a family that had returned home, and this is when he went and killed Ambrose Griffin. And around this time, Richard also set a fire in the parking lot of his apartment with a bundle of newspapers. He hoped this fire would like drive away the neighbors that he was convinced was spying on him. He didn't really seem intent on hurting anyone because he did alert people to the fire and like it was able to be put out without any injuries, but he also just kept like lighting little fires in different areas. So on the day he tried to get into Janine Layton's home and had broken into Robert and Barbara Edwards' house, that's also the day that he ran into Nancy Holden at the pantry market. So when police are following up on that lead, they decide to go speak to Richard. So they speak to his landlord, and she's like, he's just kind of an odd, quiet man who keeps to himself, and only his mother Beatrice came to visit him, and she also paid his rent and dropped off groceries. So she said he was odd and sometimes a nuisance, but never really did anything like super outlandish or illegal that she was aware of. So the police tried to knock on the door, but he did not answer. So the landlord would not let them in without a warrant, but they did give them a key to the empty apartment next door. So I guess she's like, I'm not going to let you like in, but like you can kind of like see what you can find out by hanging out in the apartment next door.
Mm-hmm.
So they did hear someone walking around in the apartment, and since Richard lived alone, they're like, okay, this has to be him. So they tried to call him, and he answered, but he did hang up shortly after. But so they do know for sure now that Richard is in the apartment. So they decide to try and trick Richard into thinking that they've left. So two detectives are like loudly saying outside his door how they're giving up and going home, which I feel like is just like
It makes me
so
laugh
cliche.
just because they're just like, I feel like I can just see them outside the door being like, yeah, man, I guess we can't find him. I guess it's time to go home. Like, I
And
don't
then
know
like
why. That's
thump,
the
thump,
vision in my
thump,
head.
like
Yeah,
walking away
stomp
loudly.
away.
Yeah. But you know, it worked, and eventually Richard opened the door and emerged carrying like a McDonald's box. So not like a Happy Meal box, but one of their boxes that they would use to ship frozen fries in. So no one's really sure like how he got this box. Like he didn't really work at McDonald's or have any connections. I mean, maybe he got it out of a dumpster or something. I don't know. But he had this big McDonald's box. So he was heading towards his car when an officer jumped him. So Richard hurried the other way, but he was stopped by the other detective, and Richard threw the box at one of the other officers, and the officer hit him with his gun. So Richard fought against the officers hard, and he was stronger than he looked, but finally, after a bit of a struggle, they were able to handcuff him. So they did pull a wallet out of one of his pockets, and inside was Danny Meredith's driver's license. There were also various cards, as well as pictures of Evelyn and Jason Moroth. And inside the McDonald's box was a pair of bloodied rubber gloves, rags, 22 caliber bullets, a key ring with 16 keys, David Ferreria's diaper pin, and an envelope with brain matter sealed inside. So they do realize at this point it is pretty obvious that they have caught this killer. I mean, I don't know what more pieces of evidence you could want.
And that's kind of what they meant when they were like, how is all of this falling? You know, they were like, we just kind of followed this lead. And then he like looked similar. And then now it's like everything is just falling into our lap, basically. It's just all there.
Like literally this random person who's like, oh, he was kind of creepy in a grocery store. Here's his name because he kind of looks like the guy that was kind of creepy to me in a grocery store. Like what? Like
crazy.
So so they know they have the killer, but they're still wondering like where is David because they still have not found any sign of David. And while in the car, Richard just ignored all of the officers' questions. So at the station, they're like trying to proceed very cautiously. They don't want any possible statements to like be thrown out if this is taken to trial. So they handed him a card detailing his rights and made sure he understood. And Richard just denied ever killing anyone. He said he only ran because he was half asleep when he came out of his apartment. He said the only thing that was in the McDonald's box was paper, which clearly is just false. I mean, he denied being in the areas of any of the murders or running into Nancy Holden. He did admit to killing dogs, but denied killing any humans. He said he never drank human blood or was a cannibal. He said he was being framed by Italians. The real suspect was just some blonde guy. Like, clearly they're just not getting anything out of him. Like, he's not going to discuss what actually happened.
And when Richard says he killed dogs, he was like literally like going to adoption centers, adopting dogs to kill them, finding ads in papers to find dogs. Like when I say this man killed hundreds of dogs, it's not an exaggeration. Like I didn't want to include too much of it because like, it's brutal and like it's it's not the same as killing like one of the victims here, so I didn't want to
Mhm.
focus too much on that. But I
Yeah.
mean, he for years adopted dogs to kill them,
Oh,
to find dogs to kill them like habitually. Yeah.
that's rough.
Yeah.
So eventually, somehow, a top public defender took on his case, which don't know how you got someone to do that, but apparently you did. And while they were interviewing Richard at the station, other officers were searching his apartment, and it just smelled of rot and decay. There was blood everywhere. They found 22 caliber bullets and bone fragments. Other weapons were found in the apartment as well, including a blood-drenched hatchet and machete. And in the freezer, they also found a half-gallon container filled with the meat, kidneys, liver, and heart of an unidentified animal. There were also feces all over the floor of the bedroom, and piles of newspapers that contained news about the recent murders. So Richard went to jail, and it was quite clear that he would not last long in prison. The first night in Sacramento County Jail, the other inmates were very fired up, like they knew about this newcomer and what he had done. They wanted him dead. Some men urinated in cups and like flung it into his cell. Some threw their feces. Others were like, "We're gonna kill you as soon as we can." Like just, I mean, immediately attacking this man.
Mhm.
So he was moved to a single isolated cell. So the search for David continued. It had been about 6 weeks, but they're still like hoping that they could possibly find him. They did try searching Richard's apartment complex with scent sniffing dogs, but there was no luck, and any possible leads just did not pan out. Unfortunately, David was finally found in late March. A janitor for the Arcade Wesleyan Church was making his usual rounds when he found something odd. So there was a gate unlocked behind the church and a cardboard box not too far in the distance. So the smell soon hit them, and like they just knew that there was something there that had been dead for a while. So at first he wondered if it was a deceased pet, but when they got closer, they did see that it was a child. So they called the police, and it was the body of David Ferreira, who was still wearing his Sesame Street trousers at the time. So David had been decapitated, and his head was beneath his torso, and next to his body, they did find the keys to Danny's car. So clearly, Richard has some mental illness, and they're trying to figure out like if he's actually unfit to stand trial. But eventually, they did find him sane enough to go to trial. So they believe that while he obviously has a mental illness, he still knew right from wrong, and he did apologize for the murders as well. And on January 2nd, 1979, Richard's trial began. So his defense attorney was trying to push for not guilty by reason of insanity, but that just seemed more and more unlikely. So then he started trying to push for second-degree murder to save Richard from the death penalty, but that also just seemed unlikely. The prosecution presented how Richard would stalk out the neighborhoods. They also mentioned how he would go into houses with unlocked doors, windows, or garages. Like, it just seemed like he only believed he was allowed in, like, if it was unlocked. Like, if it was locked, he would just move on, like in the case of Janine Layton. So they're like, clearly this is, like, thought through and planned, and this isn't a spur of the moment kind of thing. So during Richard's trial, he eventually told the court what he really believed. He said that his heart was shrinking, that he didn't want to die, and in order to save his own life, he had to end the lives of others. He said that he didn't want to, but the only way to save him was the blood of other humans. He also admitted to eating parts of David's brain, but he said he didn't like remember doing this. He said that he couldn't cope with the world anymore. Every time I try to get up and act like a human being, I couldn't because of the weakness. Mental illness makes me get dizzy and lose my sense of reality. It puts me to sleep, kind of. Which, like, clearly this man has some severe mental illness, but it's...
That is the thing, is it's like, I do wonder what his life would have been like with more proper treatment. And it seems
Yeah.
like, I mean, maybe, I don't know how much we've expanded as far as medication goes from this time, but it's like, could he have just turned out different? And it's just so
Yeah.
hard because it's like his mental illness is making him believe he's low on blood, and like he knows it's wrong to do this, which is why they were like, we can't take you to trial.
Yeah.
But like, what's making you believe this? Like,
Yeah.
clearly a lot of untreated mental illness here.
Yeah. And like it's the 70s, so it's like things are different in terms of what they can do for you or choose to do for you or whatever.
Yeah.
And on May 8th, 1979, 29-year-old Richard Chase was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Evelyn Maroth, Danny Meredith, Jason Maroth, and David Ferraria. He was sentenced to death row at the San Quentin State Penitentiary. Penitentiary.
Penitentiary. No, now I can't say. Penitentiary. Okay.
Penitentiary. However, Richard did not make it to his state execution because on December 26, 1980, Richard was found dead in his cell by an overdose of hoarded antidepressant medication. So his psychologists are unsure if this was like a planned death by suicide or if it could just be like his mental illness. So they're wondering like maybe he thought that like saving up the pills and taking this large dose would solve all of his ailments, similar to like how he did with the rabbit blood. But most think that this was likely just a death by suicide rather than accidentally over-medicating himself. So those are the absolutely horrific and gruesome murders of Ambrose Griffin, Teresa Wallen, Evelyn Maroth, Danny Meredith, Jason Maroth, and David Ferraria.
Yeah. This was a brutal one.
This was bad.
I feel like a lot of times, like when I remember this one, like people focus on the whole like, oh, like he thought like if a door was locked, it meant it was a sign for him not to go in. And if it was open, it was a sign to go in. And I think we remember that part and not all the gruesomeness of the murders. Because when I was doing it, I was like, what did I do to myself? What? And he was only 29 when he was found guilty. Like that shocked me. I was just like, that's like my age. That's so young. Not that you can't be young and like a serial killer, but it was just like baffling to me.
When you think about the level of everything he did for the amount of time that he did it, it's shocking that he was so young, you know?
Yeah, he was like 30 years old by the time he had done all of this and died. Like,
yeah.
Crazy.
I do wonder if this happened today, if he would have been found either not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, or if he at least would not have gotten the death penalty. Like, I
definitely don't think he would have gotten the death penalty. I don't think you can if there's any sign of mental illness. Can you be found guilty but also sentenced to like a mental health hospital? I guess not. So maybe it would just have to be the not guilty and sentenced. But would it have helped? I mean, that's the question. It didn't help the first time. He escaped. He was still drinking rabbit blood. Like, it might have been the same outcome where he hoards all the pills and just takes them at once. I mean, I don't know.
Like you said, like, are there different medications today or better like medication regimens that would have been able to help him get better? I mean, I don't think he ever should have been released no matter what. Like, I feel like there's a certain point where it's like, even if it was your mental illness, like this level of depravity, I personally do not feel you can come back from. So like, even if you go to a mental hospital for the rest of your life and you get on medication and you're better, great. I still don't think you belong out in this world with everyone else. Like, and I'm sure some people disagree and think that if you're truly rehabilitated, that you should be allowed to rejoin. And depending on the case, that may be, but I don't think so for this one.
I don't either. And I think for him to be better, he would have to be regularly medicated. But it makes me think of this other story where it was like this guy, like when he was like in the mental health hospitals, like he was doing well, everything, getting the whatever. But as soon as he was let go, like he wouldn't keep up with the regiments. So would this have happened with Richard Chase and with like his dad? I didn't include his dad's comment because I probably should have, just so we could roast him, but it was just a comment being like, oh, they're taking my son away, blah, blah, blah. Like Richard Sr. and Beatrice, I don't think would have pushed him to keep up with the medicine and going. They just like coddled him a little bit. And I
they
get
just excused his behaviors and were not.
But yeah, his dad made just basically a disgusting comment after he was sentenced about all of that. And it's just like, but can you not see like what your son has done? Like,
I do wonder too, like if he was able to get into a mental hospital, was able to get better, like would he have like an Andrea Yates moment where like once he was in the right mental state that he's like, I don't need to ever come out? Because like you would be horrified by what you had done once you were mentally healthy. You know what I mean? Like how could you come to terms with what you had done and be like, yeah, I think I deserve to be walking around with every other
Yeah.
human on this earth. I don't.
Yeah, and also having obviously severe mental health like disease and his like drug use. I don't know how much of his brain was just fried from that, honestly.
Yeah.
I know like marijuana, like whatever, but like LSD and stuff, like that's pretty like mind altering. And I don't
Hmm.
even know what regular long-term obsessive use of that can do to your brain. So, I mean,
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, I cut it out when editing this episode, but in the 3 years of doing this podcast, this is the first time I've ever cried during an episode that I just could not get through um, the paragraph about finding David's body.
yeah,
So we apologize for doing that to you guys too, because
it was a rough one. And like as I was doing the research, I was just like, oh, it's just like heartbreak after heartbreak and just
yeah,
horrible. And yeah.
like I really want to go like get my daughter out of bed and just hold her for a little bit, even though I know she's then going to have trouble going back to sleep, and then I'm going to regret that decision. But I just kind of feel
Yeah.
like I need to hold her little body right now. Oh boy, Courtney.
When? Oh God, I don't know what my perk of the week is.
I know. I tried to say, oh boy, Courtney, and it just came out as, oh boy, Courtney.
Oh, Courtney.
Oh, Courtney.
Courtney.
Courtney, I hope you have a good perk of the week because we all needed after that one.
My perk of the week is that this weekend, my neighborhood did like a little pub crawl thing that was free. And if you went to 6 of the 9 places, like you got like a little passport, you could turn it in to win a prize. But I did my first pickleback this weekend and I
Oh, that's
actually
nice.
loved it.
Hmm.
So I think Jacqueline saw me doing like, I did at least 2.
Yeah, she did a few.
Yeah. But it was really good. Like I didn't know
Hmm.
how I'd feel about it, but I feel like the pickle juice after the Jameson is just like you don't taste the Jameson anymore. And as
Yeah.
someone who gets like gaggy at whiskey, it was perfect. So
That is nice.
yeah, that's my perk of the week is maybe I found a new shot I'll order at a bar
There
sometime.
you go. I
But it was just
probably,
a fun weekend exploring my neighborhood some more
yeah.
and loving it. But
I mean, you do live in a really cool neighborhood. It was also my
yes,
first time getting to explore your neighborhood, so I really
that's
enjoyed
true.
that
Yeah.
too. I also may have done one with you if I wasn't so hungover from our party the night before. So,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
been quite the
Jacqueline was pretty
weekend, guys.
hungover.
Yeah,
I was
Jacqueline
with her
got,
that Friday night and we went to the bathroom together as we always do.
of
And
course.
she was like, I'm kind of tipsy. And then someone tried to hand her a shot when we left. And I was like, I'm sorry, no, she can't take that one right now. And I
Hmm.
felt really bad about it and was like, well, if you want to take it. But then after seeing you with that last shot, I was like, if you'd had 2 shots,
Yeah,
I think it would have been bad. So I think I did the right thing.
I think so too. Somebody probably should have stopped me from taking the last shot too, because like I was good up until that point with like drinking my beers, and then like that one just put me over, and then
Yeah.
my toddler had to
Shots
wake
will
up
do
at
that.
7 a.m. and just and she wasn't crying, she's just talking, but she's Mama Dada in the bed, Mama Dada, time to wake up, because she was in the room with us because we stayed over at my aunt's house because we were wasted. And
Yeah.
so she's just talking to us from her crib, and I'm
Hand
trying
her
to
tablet with Miss Rachel and be like, just sit here.
just you just need a minute. I'm like trying to like puke because I'm hungover, and then like get her out of bed, and it was a hot mess. And then we were supposed to go out with Courtney later that afternoon, and I'm like, oh boy. But then we came home and somehow Andrew made breakfast, and I'm like, sir, how are you looking at raw eggs right now? Because I am dying.
Yeah.
But he made us some coffee, he made us some breakfast. We all ate. Millie watched a couple movies, thankfully took a nap. So we all took a nap, and then, we rallied and we were ready to go in the afternoon. So,
I
it all
have
worked
found
out.
the best hangover cure I've found so far for when I'm kind of pukey, is some type of potato, like a hash brown is the
Mm,
best. Like a hash brown
makes
patty is the
sense.
best option. Maybe
Hmm.
some fries, like something a little greasy potatoey. I feel like it
Yeah,
soaks up the acid. So
that
on
makes
the days
sense.
where I wake up and I literally cannot stop puking,
Hmm.
that's been my one cure.
That's good to know. That's good to know.
But yeah, I was surprised I wasn't hungover this morning because I had picklebacks and I had an Irish Slammer, which is basically the Guinness Bailey's Jameson shot that we're not allowed to say anymore because it's a little dicey with the history.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but it was a fun day.
I mean, I think you probably also were not hungover because you drank for such a long period of time. Like it wasn't like you had to cram them all into like a short period of time. It was, you know, kind of spread out
And
throughout the whole
pickle juice
day.
is supposed to be like hydrating kind of.
That's
Like pickle
true.
juice is
Yeah.
good for you. So I think that helped too.
The
It was like,
salt
oh
and
yeah, it was, you know, a little mixture.
Yeah, makes sense.
But yeah, so that is my perk of the week. Jacqueline, what is your perk of the week?
So like that's also kind of my perk of the week because Courtney and I had a really fun weekend, you know, with some other people and my family and stuff. But also I wanted to add too. So we mentioned this last week when we recorded, but last week was like the day the time changed, so I did not get to experience the late sunset as of the time that we recorded it. But now it's been a week of like 8 p.m. sunsets, and it's glorious. I mean,
it's nice.
It's hard waking up in the morning when it's still dark outside. Like that's going to take, you know, a bit to get used to, but having the sun in the evening is just, and hopefully it'll get warm again soon so we can appreciate the sun in the evening.
I think it's supposed to get warmer this week. I think it's supposed to get back up in the 60s.
I hope so. I know this weekend's supposed to be nice, but we're not going to be here this weekend, neither of us. So hopefully it'll be nice where we are this weekend.
My latest report says it's going to rain Friday and Saturday. Where I am.
That's disappointing.
That's
you can just come with us instead if it's going to look better there. Just change your anniversary trip to come with me.
I already paid, so I don't think I can.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also want to add too that I'm super excited for this summer in Tennessee where the sun sets even later because we've lived more east the last 10 years. So the sun sets about half an hour earlier, you know, at all times. So like now that it's summer and it's setting as late as possible, now we get an extra 30 minutes on top of that as late as possible. And it's gonna be like 9 p.m. before the sun sets. And I'm so ready for this.
It's glorious.
So excited. Just like our next party at my aunt's house, we'll be sitting out there chilling and like the sun will just slowly making its descent and it'll be warmer. Yeah. Or we can have a party on my new deck too.
That's true. That is well.
I'm ready for. Yeah. You know, I feel like we just need something else really good to end this on, but I
got nothing. The tank is empty.
Yeah, it has been quite the couple weeks and now we're recording 3 episodes in a like 48-hour time span to get ready for both of us being away for a weekend and having to get our bonus out and all that good stuff. So we are just kind of, especially after this weekend, we're kind of done. And I know you guys couldn't see the face I made, so hopefully you could picture it in your head.
Yeah, our bonus though, please sign up on patreon.com/caffeinatecrimes because in addition to having like 30 bonuses, this month's bonus is we listened to our first episode of the podcast and reflected on it. It was a little brutal, it was a little rough. We've come a long way. But if you want to hear more of our thoughts, more of our process, how we do the podcast, what we've improved, what we fucked up, sign up for Patreon. Even just a month or two, listen, even at the $3 tier. If you just want to do $3 a month, you get all those bonuses. You get ad-free episodes. You get a lot of perks at all levels. So don't hesitate to sign up for that.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good episode. And I think we kind of gave you guys some like insight to like the back end of what the podcast looks like and how we've kind of evolved as podcasters and editors and you know, sound engineers. Is that what we are? You know,
and
all
producers.
That good stuff, right? Like we should do like a sound, like a, what's that word I'm looking for? Like the music at the end where it's like this podcast as well and like list all of the stuff.
Oh yeah.
Both of our names. Just
this podcast is a Jacqueline and Courtney original. Editor, Courtney and Jacqueline. Producer, Courtney and Jacqueline. Writers, Courtney and Jacqueline. Researchers, Jacqueline and Courtney.
How annoyed would you guys be with us if you had to listen to that shit at the end of each podcast? But we also asked this in the Patreon and I want to ask it here as well so we can get some more feedback. But like, when did you guys start listening? Like, what episode did you guys start listening on? So when you guys found us, so those of you who this is not your first episode, which if this is your first episode, tell us that too. And if it is, I'm so sorry. This was
a brutal one.
I hope you come back. But let us know like what episode you started on. Did you start at the very beginning? Did you start on like the most recent? Did you like stumble upon us because you were like looking up someone specific that we had done an episode on? Like, I just want to know how you guys, how you found us in general. Like, if you don't know us personally and we haven't plugged our podcast to you every single time we see you, like we do with everyone that we know, how did you come across Caffeinated Crimes and
And was your
where
first
did you start?
episode one, Ed Gein? And if so, how did you stay around?
Yeah. But thank
How?
you. But how?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, well, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. Give us 5 stars everywhere. And in the meantime, go have a cup of coffee.
And don't commit a crime.